Hello, my name is Niall McKay and welcome to Living with PSC, a podcast about the rare disease of primary sclerosing cholangitis. Now, PSC causes the bile ducts inside and outside the liver to become scarred, narrowed and eventually blocked, and leads to liver cirrhosis. In this podcast, we aim to dispel some of the myths about the disease. Today we're talking to Dr. Stephen Rossi, who is the Chief Scientific Officer with PSC Partners.
Thanks, Niall. Happy to be here.
We like to start with our origin stories.
Well, I've been committed to liver diseases and the research finding cures for various liver diseases for close to 35 years at this point. And it really started actually back when I was in pharmacy school and was on my very first clinical rotation was in liver transplant. And the very first patient I saw in a room was a PSC patient. And this is back in 1990. And the outcomes and challenges back then were pretty significant, but it always kept in my mind the unique challenges of PSC patients versus other patients who met transplant. But that was really what started me into a career in liver disease. And at that point, then I went on to do postdoctoral work, both at Nebraska and Cincinnati, really just focusing on liver disease, but in particular transplant immunology, pharmacology, and infections, and really looking at all the medications that helped keep patients alive after their surgery. It was a fascinating time in transplant and continued to grow to run large transplant centers' clinical research programs. So I really moved over to the research side to find new therapies and cures for the various liver diseases that were out there. And after transplant, I moved over into what was the most critical disease at that point, which was hepatitis C. And it's been interesting when I look back on my career. Hep C really transitioned me into working with healthcare systems and really changing how groups of patients might really be impacted by research and new research into drug therapies. But the question always comes up to me, it came up at a recent conference, is how did I land in PSC? Besides that initial patient, I think when I looked at all the liver diseases, I was fortunate to work on new therapies for Hep C. And, we basically came up with oral medications that are now a cure. And I was fortunate to work on some of those. I got to work in hepatitis B, and really we came up with new therapies that really suppressed the Hep B virus. And as I moved more into now metabolic diseases like NASH, we've made great progress there. And I was, again, fortunate to be a part of that. And similar to PBC, new therapies that I've had less of a chance to work on, but some of them succeeded, some of them didn't, but was able to see therapy move forward. But all along, and especially over the last 5 to 10 years, PSC always hung out there as the big challenge where we really didn't have we're not making progress towards a cure. You and I got to know each other when I was involved with several companies, and I've had a passion for working in PSC for a while on new therapies. And it's at one point I finally, I think we're making progress, and we'll talk maybe a little more about that down the line. But for me, being a part of finding a cure for a disease that has such a great medical need for one, I've had those challenges, and it's exciting to not only take what I've learned on the industry side and the clinical side, but actually to work directly in the patient community again.
Your resume, if you like, reads like a who's who of a lot of the top companies that are working on treatments for PSC.
I feel, again, very fortunate, but I think coming to the patient side has been a wonderful evolution for me, and really being part of the patient voice and how to bring that into the research setting in a variety of ways. And PSC Partners has had such a major impact on that. So to help lead that with my background is actually quite exciting. It's a different career path than I thought maybe 5-10 years ago, but it's been one. I've had a good relationship with PSC Partners for a long time and volunteered usually between jobs, and been very happy to come on board full time now.
And just to drill down on that idea, for example, so I suppose in the past, drug companies would decide that that there was a market perhaps, or for whatever reason, they would decide to develop a particular drug that might address a particular symptom or a particular illness, and that would be it. They would sort of drive the whole thing. But what seems to be changing in the industry overall at the moment is that it's becoming more patient focused. So groups like PSC or the Castleman disease or the rare diseases networks are going to the drug companies and saying, look, we need to address X, Y, and Z issue. Can you help us?
I think it's a good way of sort of, there's a buzz term that's out there, but I think it's actually coming into action of what's called patient-centered research. And it's evolving in a variety of settings. I think if you even look back to the old days of HIV, where patients really drove the demand for coming up with therapies that actually were what the patients wanted and needed, and it really made, sometimes in a more aggressive way, but made some big differences. But we're seeing now, this concept of focusing on what the patients really want and need, and how do we bring that back into research strategy, and frankly, how the companies, develop different drugs or treatments is becoming something that's, not only being pushed from the patient perspective, but we're seeing it at the regulatory level. The FDA conducts, in fact, we were a part of a big one, the patient focused drug development conferences that really bring the patient voice forward. I think what's fascinating is patient-centered research is really saying, okay, let's answer the questions that are most important to patients, and that patients should be part of the entire development process from the very early stages. So when you're even thinking about the first steps of how to bring a drug forward, talking to the patients and finding out what's important is really becoming almost like a standard. We wish it was a little more of a standard, but companies are really evolving to really want that voice early on. It's helpful for them because I think they start to realize that developing a medication that actually really targets the needs of the patients as opposed to maybe what they think it is, or even what the thought leaders or physician thinks is most important. So I think we're at an evolution stage for everybody to rethink how we're approaching clinical research and drug development.
Medicine was very Victorian in its attitude. It was a sort of a top-down approach, as in, this is what I'm going to do for you. And that's kind of flipping on its head at the moment as well, isn't it?
We're seeing something very different. Drug companies for a long time thought that, there were ways to bring the patient in, and the motivation was largely, especially in rare diseases, how do we bring the patient community to help us recruit for trials? And it's an important piece, patient participation and how patients can get into trials. I think is not an unimportant factor for us to think about, because getting drugs enrollment, I can tell you firsthand, is a huge issue. But I think it started this is how I brought PSC Partners when I was developing drugs, was, having the patients actually and the patient groups actually review your protocol. So suddenly bringing the patient into thinking, is a patient actually going to want to do all these things? Your physicians can sit there and tell you this is exactly, how you should design this study. But I found it incredibly powerful to have patients actually say, nope, I wouldn't do this. And, they've made some significant impact. And that really moved it forward a bit. But I think we're now getting, and this is some of the activities that PSC Partners is doing, is we're actually moving not only in from patient-centered research where we bring our perspectives forward, we're actually taking it on to be patient-led research, where in fact we are sponsoring and running important studies that matter to the patient. The one that I think a lot of people are aware of is the WIND PSC study that we're running. But we're looking at future opportunities through our, some of our collaborations to actually lead more research as opposed to just being participants. So it's again exciting to be part of leading a new way to move from the top-down approach.
And interestingly enough, as well, you're also funding research, original research in some of these areas where you feel there's a need for them.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's both. I think so. We really spent some time, and this is under the guidance of people who have moved on from PSC Partners, but really developed a research strategy ourselves that took into account the patient voice. We went out and conducted focus groups, brought it out to the physician experts, brought it back to the patients, and really developed a research strategy that gave us areas of focus not only that help us decide, like actually sponsoring different research programs instead of sort of waiting for what came to us. We really have now shifted to what are the things that are important for us to sponsor or to take on and actually execute ourselves.
If I may put in, as a former person who was on a trial myself,
Yeah,
that I would ask the companies to please contact the patients after the study
yeah.
and at least say thank you, but maybe also say you were part of the placebo or you were part of the study and this is what we achieved.
I think it's short-sighted. I mean, sometimes there's reasons you can't exactly share everything because either the study's still ongoing or it takes time to analyze things. And it's hard if you're an early patient in a study, like one of the first ones. You've got to wait a year for it to finish enrolling and then another year for it to, unblind. But that being said, it is something that I can tell you we've taken on when we're meeting with pharma companies now, and they're a little uncomfortable because I'm coming from knowing them pretty well. That we can push for that, and if you look at the PFDD survey, the Our Voices survey, when it looked at why patients didn't participate in studies or what concerned them the most when they did, one of the big ones is exactly what you brought up is, no contact from the site or the sponsor or anybody about what happened.
Yeah, I understand the legal implications and stuff like that, but
Yeah, but
it's just a lack of thought.
well, I think even, we've had several trials, for example, big trials globally that shut down because the drug didn't show to be beneficial with an interim analysis, and there was no standard language put out for the community to use. Patients are often left with those questions unanswered, and there is big picture patient facing communication that can go out to make sure the community understands what happened. And again, I think that's been done actually quite poorly.
You mentioned hepatitis, which of course was one of the massive incurable diseases and one of the main reasons for transplant.
Yeah,
And you also mentioned PBC, which
yeah.
was also a big indicator for transplant. And while, PBC is not cured, the treatments are so good now that often people don't need transplants or certainly don't need them as early as they did. I was just wondering about the National Institute for Health are doing a very large study in PSC, and they were some of the people who had done a very large study in Hep C. And I was wondering, was there any news or progress from that, or are they still very much in process?
So the NIH study is interesting and it's very fascinating, and we're very supportive of it. Have several programs that are actually looking at PSC. The first is actually and the largest one is the Children Network to better understand how pediatric patients progress. The second study is actually, I believe, from Theo Heller, is what you're referring to.
Yeah, and I think I interviewed him here on the podcast about a year ago, I think.
Yeah. So Theo's study, it's reasonably sized. I think it's supposed to be up to 40 or 50 patients. But the main thing that's fascinating about it is it's quite what we call intensive for translational research. So it's not just looking at the standard blood tests and things that we're getting, but it's actually collecting very, very deep scientific, in some cases, types of cells, I believe there's liver biopsies and even some bile direct bile collection. So it's a very intense study, but the type of information we're going to get from it will be incredible. The challenge of a smaller study is what kinds of big conclusions can you make, but it's one of the more deep scientific patient studies that I think is coming forward. Unfortunately, I think it's because of its intensity, it's a little challenge for some patients to understand all the procedures. And I'd say it's starting to enroll, but it's not enrolling as fast as we were hoping. So I think hopefully there's ways we can help communicate to the community the value of this intense type of study.
On to the International Collaborative Research Network. This is a PSC Partners initiative.
Yeah, we have 5 major projects that are ongoing, and we can talk about some of them more in detail at another time. But we obviously have the patient registry, which is an important piece of not only collecting patient information, but it really has given us a powerful tool for presenting patient perspective research. And we've put some nice publications even out of that. We have our patient reported symptoms assessment project, which is actually working with Donna Yvonne and Bryce Davis down in North Carolina to develop actually a tool for better characterizing what patients experience, not only in clinically, but it's actually meant to be a tool that could be used in clinical trials. I think, as you know, the surveys we use in clinical trials are actually really not great about capturing true patient symptoms, unless it's itch for a study for a drug that works in itch, but all the other symptoms aren't well captured. So we're partnering with them to develop actually a tool for that. The largest program we're taking on is the WIN PSC study. So this is going to be a 2,000 patient global PSC initiative that we're actually running and working with some of the best PSC thought leaders and study sites. But it's a patient funded and sponsored and run initiative. It's the biggest thing that we've taken on, and the FDA even was commending us for taking on this initiative. The goal of it is to hopefully replace placebo in some of the registration trials, because 2,000 patients will allow us to really understand the population and how that might impact from a safety perspective versus a drug. But the last thing is what you brought up, which is really launching us into what could we do next. And this is what we just conducted as part right before our patient conference, which was the International Collaborative Research Network. And this was founded really based on the research strategy that we did in order to develop that over the prior 2 years and really come up with, again, what's important to the patients, and then bring together some of the top thought leaders in PSC and identify and prioritize what types of proposals and research could address those. And so we brought together what ended up being, I think it was just over 50 experts from all over the world to really focus on this. And I can go into more details, but I'm sure you have other questions too.
Yeah, well, it is. I was interested in it. I have interviewed some of the people on the podcast as well, but what to me was very interesting was just that there are centers of excellence, in Toronto, in Norway, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and in the United States, of course, in Boston, Brigham Young Women's Hospital and stuff. So there are these centers of excellence, if you like, in PSC that really know about the disease. And these were some of the people that you did bring together.
Yeah, no. And I think what was fascinating is, yes, we had representatives of centers of excellence. We had actually members of the FDA there. We had people who worked in everything from the basic science side of things all the way through focusing on clinical trials. So it was a wide range of individuals. And we had four working groups. The first was clinical trials and endpoints. So really trying to understand how can we design studies that could, in addition to wind, further accelerate drug development and finding cures. The second was diagnosis and prognosis, and that really looked at a variety of things of, to some extent, how to diagnose PSC earlier, but really trying to make a difference in things like how do we early detect cholangiocarcinoma and how do we potentially predict recurrent PSC after transplant. So really looking at the risk of progression of some very specific diseases. And then we had the pathophysiology group, which really dove into the deep science of understanding the mechanisms or what we don't know about PSC and how can we possibly better understand that to, in particular, identify new targets for treatment. And the last group was really focused on the relationship of the gut and the liver, obviously, with the close relationship of IBD and PSC. There's a lot we can understand from that population and how they may influence each other and what kinds of interventions, even at the gut level, may have a big impact on the liver and PSC. So we had four great groups, all with about 10 to 12 people. Importantly, there were patients from PSC Partners as well as other settings that actually were part of these working groups.
I think in 2016 was probably my first conference, and at that stage, it wasn't hopeless, but we didn't really have any progress on the scientific side of perhaps finding a treatment or even a cure. But that's changed fairly radically in the last while, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. I do want to comment one thing though before we move on to that is I think the unique people ask what was unique about the ICRN. And when we hear the feedback from it, most of these people are part of other collaborative groups, part of the International PSC Study Group or their own networks within their country or out. But what was amazing, and I think it's because it was patient sponsored, is the collaborative energy, the focus, and the fact that we came out of there with multiple possible proposals for research. Everybody, the thought leaders, all gave us feedback that they had not participated in anything like this before. And they were so excited to continue. And we felt like we came out of that with some ideas that actually might make a difference. So I do want to highlight that these patient-led programs open people up to thinking differently and they get out of maybe their competitive places. Industry was not there. We will involve industry down the line, but that also allowed the regulators to be more comfortable to share things. So it was an amazing, not by our own admission, but by everybody who gave us feedback. And they're all excited to continue to participate and work on these proposals. So I think that leads into, kind of a sense of hopefulness that things are moving in the right direction for PSC. So I apologize, but I wanted to make sure that was very
Wonderful.
clearly understood.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's wonderful. And of course, if you're, if you're a physician, I'm sure you get to meet plenty of patients. But if you're a research scientist, you may not meet the people whose lives you're trying to save ever.
No, no. We heard that from like many of the participants actually stayed on for the patient conference and were speakers, but also just stayed and participated. And we heard from all of them that many of them who are basic science researchers or great statisticians and people who clearly have passion for doing this had never really spent time with patients or seen the perspectives that they got to see. So, as much as you get to sit with Gideon Hirschfield, there's people who came back and said, "Oh my God, this was incredible having dinner with patients and hearing their experience." So it works both ways. It's really amazing.
That's wonderful. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where we are. Like,
Yeah.
in terms of in terms of the research? Is there? I know there's no magic pill as yet, unfortunately, but can you tell us a little bit about where we are in that process?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of positive things evolving that have kind of been hovering out there, but I think um, unfortunately, due to some failed experiments, I think we're learning possibly about other ways to approach PSC. So I'll take it maybe in sort of a few buckets. For a long time, I think we spent most of our time worrying about, can we move alk phos? Can we move liver enzymes? And I think several studies, including NGM and others, we learned along the way. And I think it's pretty standard in the community that although alk phos is an important marker, in terms of it actually being a good marker for treatment and treatment response, it's been challenging. And especially since some of the drugs may not be as powerful or may not actually work super fast to lower alk phos. So I think some of our failures with alk phos have really forced us to look at other ways for endpoints. And we're now starting to see, and I would say this started with NGM, but also now more recently, the Pliant compound is really looking at the impact on markers of liver fibrosis. And ultimately, that is going to be, if we can sort of make an impact on fibrosis or at least stabilize things, we're going to have some big leaps forward, and basically maybe patients won't improve their fibrosis, but they may not progress. I mean, we hope that if we can block things, that it will improve over time. We all know it's going to takes a long time to get there. It's probably going to take at least some time to get back there. But I think the focus on getting away from alk phos and focusing on things that actually translate to maybe what's going on in the liver more is a big move.
So this would it wouldn't be a cure in terms of that we wouldn't be addressing what's going on in the bile ducts, but what we would be able to do is prevent liver failure.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good way to simplify it. I think in terms of so I think that's a big move. And it may also impact, we don't know this yet, but we know it impacts fibrosis within the main parts of the liver. We're hoping, and there's maybe some early signals that it may also significantly impact the scarring in the bile ducts themselves. So
Oh wow.
we've really focused largely on the what we call the parenchymal or the hepatocytes, but there's some hopes that that there's early signals, but again, I think even just stopping the progression to a liver failure and the move to transplant would be a huge move for us, and a big I think benefit for patients. I think the other things that we're seeing is that there are possibly some interesting immunologic pathways that we've tried for years to repurpose drugs for IBD, immunosuppressants that are used in transplant, a lot of drugs that work at the immune level, but we haven't seen a significant benefit. There's some new immunologic targets that are being focused on that may give us a different perspective on how we deal with inflammation, and also some of the cells that may be causing PSC related injury. So I think some nice new developments in understanding what those targets might be, and possibly some drugs that are working on them. So completely different from liver fibrosis, but really focusing maybe more on the cells that kind of cause the fibrosis. So I think that's kind of an interesting new approach that we tried, but maybe now that we know more about the targets, we actually can try some drugs that are very different.
So this would be sort of dampening the obviously big part of any autoimmune disease, but particularly PSC, is the immune system is sort of attacking the body in in very crude sense. So
Yeah.
the idea would be to dampen down the immune system a little bit so that it's not attacking the bile ducts or not
Yeah.
attacking.
But
Yeah,
but but we've always known that, but it's always been a challenge that PSC is an autoimmune disease, but we don't know exactly what it's attack. We know what the end result is, but what's doing the attacking? And there aren't what are the autoantibodies, if you want to call them, that actually are responsible for and the pathways for those injuries. We're now getting better. So it's not just the broad immune system anymore, because other diseases you can get away with that. This is really maybe we're finding the immune targets, if that makes sense, and a much better understanding than we've had in the past with that. So I think that's an important one. The last one, I think, where we're making, and everybody hears us talking about it, but we're really understanding much better the relationship of the gut and the microbiome,
yeah,
and or when I say microbiome, the bacteria in the gut, and how those things may play on disease, how fast something progresses. But also there may be opportunities to alter those things and understand how we might be able to treat some aspects of the gut that could have significant improvement in the liver. So that is a whole new field that is exploding. And if you go to all the medical conferences right now, there's so much about what you'll hear, the gut liver axis and the microbiome, and understanding more about it. But importantly, you have to move from let's understand it more. Now, what are we going to do to use it as a therapy? And that's really a push we have to make more of. And that's where I think the patient voice is important in saying, we appreciate all the scientific work, but let's also try and understand how this translates to a treatment. And we see that now in a lot of the research grants we get proposals on, that leap to why is this study in a lab important to identifying a treatment. But the microbiome is big right
yeah,
now.
and I think there's some good work being done here in University College Cork regarding the microbiome and depression.
Yeah,
Uh, that there's a link there as
yeah,
well. But
and
it's
then,
in
I
every
mean,
disease.
the Nordic group. The Nordic group is actually the Norwegians are really leading this area and have really identified some fascinating work there as well.
Yeah. Well, I think is there anything else?
I'll bring one last thing, is that I think the more of these things that we develop, and there's even drugs, as we know, that are active in PBC. And while all of them haven't translated to PSC, there's a couple of new ones. Seladelpar, I think, that is likely going to get approved for PBC, and elafibranor, same thing. Both are, elafibranor is actually doing a study in PSC. Simibe or Seladelpar, were previously going to launch a study, and I think will move, according to their website, are likely going to go back into PSC. So there are other new drugs that are also coming about. I will say, as PSC partners, we get probably once a month a company that reaches out to us who is either in preclinical or early stages that wants to meet with us to talk about PSC and the patient perspective. So there are a lot of companies that are showing interest in the different stages of PSC, even symptoms like pruritus. So I'll finish with saying that, one, we've got a lot of interest and excitement. What is also probably likely going to be the case down the line is we'll look at combination therapy, which will only improve the outcomes of these single drugs, I think. But we got to get those first steps of a good single drug first to do that. But I think, and we heard this at the patient conference, I'd say in the next 5 years, we're going to see a big breakthrough.
Wonderful. And the two drugs you mentioned, are they working on the bile flow or what?
It's interesting. So seladelpar, and elafibranor, both are what are called PPAR agonists. They target a specific, how do I say it simply, a specific pathway that has a variety of effects. Some of it is actually inflammation. Some of it is fibrosis, so it does have some they have some antifibrotic effect. And some of the secondary benefits of it you do see a decrease in cholestasis. So you do see movement in liver enzymes while on these treatments. Now, both those drugs have very powerful phase 3 data in PBC. We have yet to see PSC data, but I think we'll be seeing some of that soon. I would say of the drugs, and there's an off-label drug in Europe as a fibrate. That's another PPAR. All that class of the PPARs, and there's different types, but in general, they seem to have some unique benefits in PBC at least, and with some of the preliminary PSC data looks quite good. But
Wonderful.
And the good thing about those drugs is they have good safety databases because of all the work that's been done in PBC. So we understand those drugs a little bit more because they've been studied in liver disease patients. Granted, we still have to understand them in PSC very carefully.
I understand. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but the sort of principal thing is do no harm, I suppose. But
Yeah,
you know that they're not doing any harm.
for the most part. I mean, I feel much more confident testing a medication in where there's been at least another phase 3 study in somebody with underlying liver disease. So it's very helpful to have that information.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Stephen Rossi, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we'll have you back on the podcast
No,
in the
love
future.
love to share our experiences with the community, and thank you for all the great work you do.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week. For more information about PSC and for a list of people and topics we'll be covering in the near future, please go to www.pscpartners.org. That's www.pscpartners.org. PSC Partners is a non-profit organisation dedicated to providing education and support to primary sclerosing cholangitis patients. There is information and resources on the website. There is a conference once a year. There is a private Facebook group that you can also join. Also, please join our patient registry. This is an anonymous database that provides research support to the medical community who are researching this disease. Thank you very much for listening.